When the general who was in charge of Antony's forces in Libya changed sides to support Octavian, Antony tried to kill himself. However, he was prevented by his friends from doing this, and they brought him to Alexandria. There, he discovered that Cleopatra was about to attempt something daring and dangerous. There is the Isthmus, a narrow strip of land which separates the Red Sea from the Mediterranean Sea off Egypt, and is considered to separate Asia and Libya, and is at its shortest no more than about 40 miles wide. Here Cleopatra was going to lift her fleet out of water and drag the ships across the isthmus. She would then relaunch them in the Arabian Gulf with a lot of money and enough force to settle in parts outside Egypt. In this way, she hoped to escape war and slavery. But when the Arabians from Petra burned the first ships to be dragged up, and while Antony still thought his army at Actium remained together, she stopped what she was doing and placed guards on the approaches to her kingdom. At this time, Antony left the city and his friends and prepared a house for himself by the island of Pharos by building it out to the sea. Here he exiled himself from everyone and stated that he was happy to live the life of Timon since he had suffered a similar fate. For his friends had treated him badly and had been ungrateful, and so he had hated and distrusted all men. At the same time, Antony and Cleopatra also sent envoys to Octavian in Asia. Cleopatra asked Octavian to allow her children to have the kingdom of Egypt, and Antony asked if he could live as a private citizen in Athens if he could not remain in Egypt. However, they had few friends they could trust because of the desertion. So they sent the teacher of the children, Alexis the Laodicean, who became known to Antony in Rome through Timogenes, and he had more influence with Antony than any other Greeks. He had also been Cleopatra's most effective weapon against Antony and had opposed any favorable views that Antony had of Octavia. He had already been sent to keep Herod from changing sides and supporting Octavian. However, he stayed there and betrayed Antony and still dared to appear before Octavian, trusting in Herod's support. Herod, however, did nothing to help him. He was immediately arrested and taken into chains to his own country, where he was executed on Octavian's orders. That was the penalty that Alexis paid for being disloyal while Antony was still alive. Octavian rejected the proposals for Antony, but told Cleopatra that he would agree to any reasonable request, provided that she either killed Antony or threw him out of Egypt. He also sent one of his own freedmen, Thyrsis. He was a sensible and persuasive man who could deliver messages from a young general to a woman who was proud and amazingly certain of the power of her beauty. This man had talked to Cleopatra for longer periods than the rest, and was so noticeably honored by her that Antony became suspicious. As a result, he had him taken and whipped, and on sending him back to Octavian, Antony wrote that Thyrsis had been so insulting and arrogant that he had annoyed him when he was so easily provoked by his own problems. But if you object to this, he said, you have my freedman Hipparchus. Hang him up and whip him, and then after this we will be equal. After this, Cleopatra, in an effort to lessen Antony's complaints and his suspicions, paid a lot of attention to him. She, for her birthday, celebrated it in a way that was befitting to her reduced circumstances. But Antony's birthday, but she celebrated his with every expensive luxury. And so much so that the people invited to the dinner were poor when they arrived, but rich when they left. Meanwhile, Agrippa had been sending Octavian letters, telling Octavian to return to Rome because matters there urgently needed his attention, so the war was put off for the moment. But once winter was over, Octavian once again marched through Syria, and his generals with their armies went through Libya. Cleopatra had prepared some tombs and monuments of considerable height and beauty near the temple of Isis. She gathered together there the most valuable of the royal treasures: gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, ebony, ivory, some cinnamon. In addition, she had collected a lot of firewood and hemp. Well, this made Octavian afraid that in desperation the woman would burn the wealth. So he was always sending her some kind of hopes that he would be generous to her while his army advanced closer to Alexandria. When Octavian encamped near the Hippodrome, Antony attacked him. He fought outstandingly and put Octavian's cavalry to flight. He chased them all the way to their camp. Then, overjoyed by his victory, he went into the palace, still in his armor, and kissed Cleopatra and presented to her one of his most courageous men of the fight. And Cleopatra gave to him as a reward a golden breastplate and helmet. The man took them, and during the next night the man deserted to Octavian. Again, Antony challenged Octavian to single combat, but Octavian replied that Antony could find many ways to die. Then Antony, realizing there was no better way to die than to die fighting, decided to attack Octavian by land and sea immediately. It is said that at dinner he ordered the slaves to pour wine and bring food for him most generously than usual, for it was uncertain whether they would be doing this the next day or be serving other masters, while he himself would be lying dead, a mummy, and having become nothing. He saw that his friends were in tears at these words, so he said that he would not lead them into battle, because he wanted an honorable death for himself rather than safety and victory. In the middle of the night, while the city was quiet and depressed, through fear and expectation of what was to happen, suddenly the sound of music with all sorts of instruments in harmony was heard. In addition, there was the shouts of a crowd mixed with Bacchic cries and jumping around of satyrs, as if some people from a party with a great noise were going out of the city. Their route seemed to go through the middle of the city towards the outer gate opposite of the enemy, where the noise got louder still and then stopped. Those who tried to interpret this omen thought that the god Dionysius, that Antony especially liked to imitate and with whom he was most associated, was now leaving him. And at daybreak, Antony himself drew up his infantry up on the hills in front of the city and watched as his ships set out and moved towards the enemy. And because he was waiting to see them do something great, he was silent. But the soldiers on his ships, as they got near to the ships of Octavian, greeted his men with their oars. When they were greeted in turn, they changed sides. So all the ships now became one fleet. They turned around and made for the city. At the same time of seeing this, Antony was deserted by his cavalry, which went over to the enemy. Then, with his infantry defeated, he returned to the city, crying out that Cleopatra had betrayed him to men with whom he waged war with, and for her sake, she, fearing his anger, when he was so out of his mind, fled for safety into her tomb, and she brought down the doors, strengthened with bolts and bars. There she sent messengers to Antony that she was dead. And he believed this. He said to himself, "Why do you delay so, Antony?" Luck had taken away the only excuse for him to cling to life. Then he went into his room. There he loosened his breastplate and said, "O Cleopatra, I do not grieve now that you have been taken from me, for I shall at once come to you. But I am sad that, being so great a general and leader, that I have been shown to be inferior to a woman in courage." Antony had with him his faithful slave named Eros, and Antony had some time before encouraged him in this very situation to kill him if necessary, and he now asked him to keep his promise. So Eros drew his sword and held it as if he was about to strike him, but then turned his face away and killed himself. He fell at his master's feet, and Antony said, "Well done, Eros. Although you could not do what was needed to be done, you showed me what I must do." Then he struck himself through the belly and fell on the bed. He did not die at once from this wound. The blood stopped flowing once he lay down. He came round and begged those nearby to strike a second blow, but they fled from the room while he was lying there, crying out in pain, until Diomedes, the secretary, came from Cleopatra with orders from her to bring him to the tomb. When he heard that she was alive, Antony eagerly ordered his servants to lift him up, and he was carried by hand to the doors of her tomb. Cleopatra, however, would not open the doors, but showed herself at a window, from which she let down ropes and cords. To these Antony was fastened, and she drew him up herself with the aid of the two women whom alone she had admitted with her into the tomb. Never, as those who were present tell us, was there a more piteous sight. Smeared with blood and struggling with death, he was drawn up, stretching out his hands to her even as he dangled in the air. For the task was not an easy one for the women, and scarcely could Cleopatra, with clinging hands and strained face, pull up the rope, while those below called out encouragement to her and shared her agony. And when she had thus got him in and laid him down, she rent her garments over him, beat and tore her breasts with her hands, wiped off some of his blood upon her face, and called him master, husband, and imperator. Indeed, she almost forgot her own ills in her pity for his. But Antony stopped her lamentations and asked for a drink of wine. Either because he was thirsty or in the hope of a speedier release. When he had drunk, he advised her to consult her own safety, if she could do it without disgrace, and among all the companions of Caesar, to put most confidence in Proculius, and not to lament him for his last reverses, but to count him happy for the good things that had been his, since he had become most illustrious of men, had won greatest power, and now had been conquered a Roman by a Roman. Scarcely was he dead when Proculius came from Caesar, Octavian. For after Antony had smitten himself, and while he was being carried to Cleopatra, Dercitaeus, one of his bodyguard, seized Antony's sword, concealed it, and stole away with it. And running to Octavian, he was the first to tell him of Antony's death, and showed him the sword all smeared with blood. When Octavian heard these things, he retired within his tent and wept for a man who had been his relation by marriage, his colleague in office and command, and his partner in many undertakings and struggles. Then he took the letters which had passed between them, called in his friends, and read the letters aloud, showing how reasonably and justly he had written, and how rude and overbearing Antony had always been in his replies. After this he sent Proculius, bidding him, if possible, above all things to get Cleopatra into his power alive, for he was fearful about the treasures in her funeral pyre, and he thought it would add greatly to the glory of his triumph if she were led in the procession of his triumph. Into the hands of Proculius, however, Cleopatra would not put herself, but she conferred with him after he had come close to the tomb and stationed himself outside at the door, which was on a level with the ground. The door was strongly fastened with bolts and bars, but allowed a passage for the voice. So they conversed, Cleopatra asking that her children might have the kingdom, and Proculius bidding her to be of good cheer and trust Octavian in everything. After Proculius had surveyed the place, he brought back word to Octavian, and Gallus was sent to have another interview with the queen, and coming up to the door, he purposefully prolonged the conversation. Meanwhile, Proculius applied a ladder and went in through the window by which the women had taken Antony inside. Then he went down at once to the very door at which Cleopatra was standing and listening to Gallus, and he had 2 servants with him. One of the women imprisoned with Cleopatra cried out, "Wretched Cleopatra, thou art taken alive!" Whereupon the queen turned about, saw Proculius, and tried to stab herself, for she had had in her girdle a dagger, such as robbers wear. But Proculius ran swiftly to her, threw both his arms about her, and said, "O Cleopatra, thou art wronging both thyself and Octavian by trying to rob him of an opportunity to show great kindness." At the same time, he took away her weapon and shook out her clothing to see whether she was concealing any poison. And there was also sent from Octavian one of his freedmen, Epaphroditus, with injunctions to keep the queen alive by the strictest vigilance, but otherwise to make any concession that would promote her ease and pleasure. Antony was 56 years of age. According to others, he was 53. Now the statues of Antony were torn down, but those of Cleopatra were left standing because Archibius, one of her friends, gave Octavian 2,000 talents in order that they might not suffer the same fate as Antony's. Antony left 7 children by his 3 wives, of whom Antyllus, the eldest, was the only one who was put to death by Caesar. The rest were taken up by Octavia and reared with her own children,